Okay.
Jess. It's for Jess.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Hello, everybody. So we'll get started in like 5 minutes, or I guess maybe 3 minutes. But welcome to Tight Lips Instagram Live with Allison Spurgis. We're going to be talking about her book, Diagnosing Desire, which looks at the creation of low desire from a sociological perspective. I'll do the full intro in like 2 minutes, but thanks for coming.
Yes, thanks everyone for coming. Okay. Just making sure I will be able to, and and I can't share the slides until you're gone. Is that right, Hannah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's what I thought.
We're having a fun time of book talk meets Instagram Live.
Yeah, it's very exciting, very new technologies, and so because I'm on through the Tight Lipped and you're on through mine, people on my feed can also.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay.
Hi, everybody. For everyone joining, we're going to get started in like a minute. We are in conversation as Tight Lipped with Allison Spurgis and her new book, Diagnosing Desire, which is about the construction of low desire in the medical community.
Yes, and I'm very excited to be here with Tight Lipped for people who are joining through through my Instagram. So thanks so much to Tight Lipped for making this happen and allowing me to crash their Instagram for the next hour or whatever it is.
Great. Okay. Let's get started. People will come in and out, and then we're also going to archive this in our feed. So if you can't come for the whole thing, you can come check it out when it's done. So I'm Hannah Schreier. I'm a founding member of Tight Lipped. I'm a PhD student in my other life. I also have pelvic floor dysfunction and, you know, all that fun stuff. So Allison Spurgis uses they, she pronouns. I use she, her pronouns, is an assistant professor of sociology at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, where they also teach in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality program. They recently published their first book, which is called Diagnosing Desire, Biopolitics and Femininity into the 21st Century, which interrogates the medical regulation and scientific production of receptive or responsive desire in women, meaning the sort of idea that women have different sexual responses than men. Through in-depth qualitative research, Allison complicates reductive explanations of gender differences in sexual desire and arousal patterns. Instead, she's highlighting the embodied psychic and material effects of gendered and sexual trauma and white straight feminine socialization. So this is Allison, and again, we're Tight-Lipped, and we're going to be talking about this exciting book about the creation of the female sexual response cycle. So Allison, you can boot me out and get started.
Okay, thank you so much, Hannah, from my Instagram over there, and I'm over here on Tight Lips. And now I have removed Hannah, but you're still there, right? Hannah, I think that you're still there. Okay. Yes, it appears that you're still there. Okay, great. Thank you so much to Tight Lips. Can you hear me now? Can people hear me? Can somebody just like give me, okay, perfect. All right, sorry. I think I got an old text message saying that I couldn't be heard. Okay, sorry about that. All right, thanks so much. Okay, so I am going to actually show some slides tonight as well. So thank you all so much for being here. And I'm just going to quickly reintroduce myself. But first, I am going to make sure that the slides can come up. Okay, so let me just pull this up real quick. Can everybody see this, the cover of my book here? People can see this? Okay, I think it's there. Okay, if anybody has a problem seeing the slides, please do let me know. Okay. Okay, so again, my name is Allison Case Burgess. I go by they and she pronouns, as Hannah mentioned. Thank you all for being here again. Before I begin my discussion today, I wanted to briefly locate myself a bit. I'm speaking to you from my living room in gentrified Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, New York, unceded Muncie, Lenape, and Canarsie land. For those who would like a visual description, I am a femme of center white person with long dark hair. It's currently pulled up, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt. This lecture will be live captioned and also captioned before it's archived. And again, I do want to thank so much Hannah Schreier, Noah Fleischacker, and all the other amazing folks at Tight Lipped for inviting me to chat about my work today. I really think that the Tight Lipped project is so awesome, and I feel really honored to be a part of your rad lineup. So thank you so much to Tight Lipped. Okay, I'm going to share another slide, and this is going to be a quote from one of my interview participants. Her name is Regina. So if folks just let me know if there's something wrong with the slides, but I'm hoping that this will work out with the slide sharing. So let me go to that. Okay, people can see this slide, I'm pretty sure. Okay, great. So this is Regina. She is a white bisexual 25-year-old, a participant in my study, and my study was, for folks who are just joining, it's a study of low desire, and I chose participants who identified as women, and as it turned out, many of them also did have pelvic floor conditions, pain conditions, a variety of chronic pain issues. So that was something that I found out later as I conducted the study, but it was originally targeted to just finding out more from people who identify as having low desire, and specifically to shed light on the phenomenon of women's low desire and how that is framed. So Regina says, the way that we as a society talk about the way that males are and the way that females are is not necessarily true to how males and females are. I believe that that is a story that we tell ourselves, that men are more sexual creatures and have a more simplistic sexuality. And it also might be self-perpetuating too. As soon as you start telling the story, people start identifying with it. So this is a quote again from Regina, white bisexual 25-year-old with chronic pain conditions and self-identifying as having low sexual desire. I'd like you all to keep this sentiment in mind as I go through the talk tonight. I think it speaks to the productive nature of the scientific discourses and medical and holistic technologies that I'm going to be discussing. So, what I'm really arguing is in my book and tonight is that there is a way that that the medicine and science that is concerned with helping women with low desire and other sexual dysfunctions actually produces really populations, norms around what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a sexual woman, and actually what women's desire is purported to look like. And I think that this is problematic, so I basically am arguing that that there is this main category that's produced by these discourses and technologies, and that is of this category of women with low desire. And I'm going to just describe kind of how this has come to be and how I understand it this evening. So my project not only critically intervenes in some of the dominant contemporary expert discourses about sex, gender, and sexuality, but I also sought to provide a space for participants. And so again, participants with low desire, many of whom also have pain conditions, to speak back to these narratives about their sexuality and to define sexual desire and pleasure in their own terms. So it's important to note that all the people I interviewed were AFAB, or assigned female of birth individuals. And at the time of the interviews, they did all identify as cis women. Many were straight, some identified as queer. They were racially diverse, but they were not class diverse. I did the study in New York City, many were students. And most were under the age of 35. I had a couple of outliers, but most were between the ages of 18 and 35. Interestingly, only one identified as asexual. And one thing that I'll talk about closer to the end is the ways that I think that this work does have a lot of resonances with theories of asexuality, with discussions of compulsory sexuality, and also with disability, critical disability theory and studies. But I do think that it's unsurprising, ultimately, that cis and straight women are disproportionately represented, because I argue that the discourses I'll be critiquing actually kind of call up, again, this cis, straight, white femininity. I'm going to show another slide. Please do let me know if you cannot see it. And, oops, sorry. Okay, so there's some hysterical women there on your screen, I think. That's what you should be seeing. So today I'll be unpacking what I call the feminized responsive desire framework within the new science of female sexuality, and specifically as this appears in contemporary popular and scientific framings. It's important to consider contemporary popular and scientific popular and scientific framings today, but it's also important to remember that these ideas are nothing new. In fact, there is a long history in Western medicine, and today I will be focusing on the global North context of an interest in sexual difference, and one that is always embedded and closely bound up with white supremacy and colonialism. There's also a long history of psychiatric investment and intervention in female sexuality, which was, of course, treated very differently depending on who you were. And there's a long history of concerns about women's purportedly low desire by scientists and doctors. So this image is just kind of meant to be kind of like a foundation for thinking about hysteria and hysterical women and the terrain in which that was kind of carved out through medicine and science. So early sexologists, psychoanalysis, and gynecologists made the female body a site of investment and study. And there was much attention to specifically feminine pathologies and neuroses like hysteria. But, and this is really crucial, I think, to also thinking about discourses today, wealthy white women were most likely to be framed as hysterical and even to experience themselves as such, while poor women, immigrant women, indigenous and women of color, and specifically Black women, were literal sites of experimentation and were often effectively ungendered. That is, when they weren't coded as hypersexual, asexual, or masculine via these colonialist civilizing discourses and their material projects. So here in my book, I draw on the work of contemporary scholars who attend to all of that, that terrain of the racializing the way that race and gender are bound up in scientific and medical discussions of sexual difference. And so here I'm thinking about people like Hortense Spillers, C. Riley Snorton, Kyla Schulder, Saidiya Hartman, Harriet Washington, and Deirdre Cooper Owens, among many others. So that's just for future reading if anybody wants to check that out. Through all of this, however, the trope of female sexual receptivity and low or responsive desire still took a firm hold. And so I'm arguing that this is like very much part and parcel of the history of sexology, this idea of women's sexuality as receptive and responsive. And although it was born out of an investment in white heterosexual femininity, it has been treated as a neutral and objective category. And it's been taken up by diverse women and AFAB folks across racial and other backgrounds, and sometimes queer folks who in some cases also experience themselves as receptive, responsive, or low in desire. This is because I argue that these ideas have such a far reach, and because they're posited as neutral. So this is what my qualitative interviews suggest. And my interviews, I didn't do a huge number, but the data that I have looked at additionally also suggests that this is, even though the category is a white cishet kind of category, it travels really far, and people across racial backgrounds and class backgrounds and of different sexualities can end up kind of taking that idea about themselves on. That idea of being receptive. So specifically, the idea that women are out of touch with their own bodies and desires, that they are disconnected, discordant, or dissociative, and that they are complex, complicated, and innately receptive is very old. And it is still alive and well, again, as evidenced by myriad popular media representations, which I'll go to in a moment. And importantly, we also see this, and this is kind of where I get to this idea of the new science of female sexuality. We also see this reappearing in contemporary scientific research and medical treatments, and today, importantly, under the guise of feminism. So a lot of the discourse that I examine is it's framed as feminist. It's framed as, like this is the new female-friendly way of thinking about sexuality. But again, I argue that this is very old and it never really disappeared. So ultimately, just a tiny bit more framing, ultimately my project seeks to illuminate how what queer theorists like Lauren Berlant and Anne Svetkovich, more just reading for you to check out if folks are not familiar, what these theorists might call an intimate public culture associated with white, straight, cisgender, receptive femininity has been and continues to be produced through not only sexual medicine and sexology, but importantly also through popular self-help style techniques, including mindfulness, meditation, and alternative forms of holistic sexual healing. And I mean, very interestingly, even through feminist anti-medicalization activism. And I argue that a lot of the feminist anti-medicalization activism around female sexual dysfunction has actually continued to kind of rest upon a very cis straight vision of women's sexuality. So even the kind of like anti-activism against FSD is still taking on these ideas and taking them up. So I really see the work that I do as an intervention and hopefully a corrective into some of this, because what I really want to focus on is how, again, this category of women with low desire is actually produced as a category of study and as a population. And I argue that people who are treated as women, and many of whom identify as women, and who are uninterested in sex for a variety of reasons, actually have very few avenues at their disposal by which to make sense of that lack of interest in sex. So that means if you, for so many different reasons, are not interested in sex, so many of us end up falling back on these tropes of receptivity and responsiveness. Well, I guess I need to be triggered more. Oh, I guess, it must be something hardwired, or it must be something, that's wrong with me or with you, whoever the person is. And I argue that part of that is because of the way it has been framed, because of the way that women have been perceived and produced. So to this end, so much of the time we come to think of ourselves as biologically lower in desire because we're women, or we come to see ourselves as naturally receptive and responsive, if not low in desire. In my book, I seek to denaturalize the category of woman as it is offered up through sexology, sex therapy, and sexual self-help, including through mindfulness and meditation, these kinds of alternative discourses, and particularly as it rests upon ideas about responsive and receptive feminine desire, and as it is so embedded in these categories of white supremacy and colonialism, as I've argued. And the stakes are high, I would say, for people, including people who don't identify as women. And who don't fit into these normative categories because of how widespread the framing is. Okay, I'm going to give you just a few more slides that kind of cover some of the main things I focus on in the book, and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A to just talk about this kind of category, how it's produced, and how it actually affects us, and how it affects people with chronic pain conditions, with low desire, people with bodies. Okay, so I will go to this, just learning how to use the live function. Okay, so this is just an image from a popular article by Daniel Bergner. And this is an article that was published in 2009 in the New York Times Magazine called "What Do Women Want?" And then there was a follow-up article that same year, so now over a decade ago, called "Women Who Want to Want." And I bring this image up because these articles for me were very important in thinking through this project. This study really began for me when I noticed that clinicians, experimental researchers, alternative healers, popular journalists, and other writers in the public sphere were demonstrating a lot of interest in low female desire. And so this really began for me in the first decade of the 21st century, around 2008, 2009, 2010. I began to see discussions of the need for new ways of thinking about women's sexuality and desire, discussed in popular articles and the media late in the first decade of the 21st century. They all took for granted, in my opinion, the notion, again, that women have low desire than men do. And they all seem to reify the idea that the real problem of women's low desire is just that women have different sexual systems from men, and that we need to study women more and possibly come up with new sexual response models to attend to women's unique and different experiences of sex. Something about this framing did not sit well with me. And so this is how this project began, is when I started to see these articles in the popular media. So I think this is really crucial also. Again, despite scientific paradigms shifting and changing technologies, most research on human sexuality has continuously suggested these kind of inherent gender differences. And so what I felt like I was seeing in the early 2000s, and this is also like kind of right after Viagra has just come out, and Viagra's become this very successful pharmaceutical targeted to people with penises, the men's sexual dysfunction drug. There's all this interest in women, and there's all this kind of attention in the first decade of the 21st century to finding the drug. Like, is there a drug for women? And it was quickly kind of decided, well, women are too complex. Women are too complicated. There can't be it's going to be too hard to find a drug for them. So I think the idea really persisted around this time, this idea that men have mechanical issues, but women have computational errors. So this idea that men have this kind of hydraulic problem with their penises, but their desire is of course intact. But that women, the people we call women, have this much more complex problem that's about their desire. And it was considered to be a serious problem, right? There was a lot of research also around this time that was suggesting that up to 40% of women have low desire, and that this is like a public health crisis. So there was a lot of, just a lot of attention to that. I'm going to show another image from, Another image just real quick here. So this is an image Actually, I'm just going to go back to the cover of my book. I can show you this real quick. So this is an earlier version of a vaginal photoplethysmograph. This is the same image that's on the front cover of my book, or it's the same device, a similar device. But I'm going to go back to the cover of my book. So here's the cover of my book again. So this device is a vaginal photoplethysmograph. It's inserted into the vagina and used to measure vaginal pulse amplitude and vaginal blood pooling. And these are both measures associated with vaginal lubrication, swelling, and vasocongestion. And all of these measures are purportedly objective measures of women's physiological arousal. These measures are usually assessed while participants watch pornography in a laboratory setting. And so basically this thing is inserted. It's used to detect, whatever physiological so-called objective arousal is occurring. And then the measures are compared to participants' so-called subjective arousal. So either how turned on they say they are, or how much they are able to recognize how physically turned on they are. Okay, so that's the metric of subjective desire. And again, this is specifically for women. So the device used for people with penises is totally different and always suggests very different things. Again, this is part of how I'm arguing the categories get produced of men and women through the medical discourse. So studies that use this device particularly consistently suggest that women are discordant, and that's the term that's used. The idea is that they have a lot of free-flowing physiological arousal, but they often cannot subjectively detect it. So the idea has been put forward that women, and of course here this is cis women, are turned on by everything. And in one famous study, even a film featuring bonobos having sex. I think that this research begs the question, and I'd be interested in hearing people's thoughts. Why do we need to compare women's or anyone's objective genital arousal to their subjective experience of arousal or desire? What does this actually tell us? And importantly here, I think for us in this conversation is who is the woman that is kind of like assumed into existence when these studies are performed and then invoked in popular representation, like in the popular media? What is this woman's demographic background? What's her sexuality? What's her race, her class, her nationality? What types of individuals, importantly also, might not even be able to or have the desire to participate in a study that uses this type of device to study so-called objective physiological arousal. So, I'm assuming you can tell that I'm arguing here that that the category is not neutral. That the woman who is called up does have a sexuality. She does have a race. It's not a neutral category, right? So that's a really important takeaway for me. Okay, I'm going to just show a couple more slides. Another really important thing that was kind of always mentioned in these early articles, as they're discussed in these early popular representations, is this kind of woman-specific sexual response model. And so this is the response model initially put forward by a Canadian sex researcher named Rosemary Basson. This was originally put forward in the year 2000. She came to call it the circular sexual response cycle model. It was originally put forward to explain the experience of desire for many straight partner women's experiences. In the seminal piece in which she introduced the model, she states, sensing an opportunity to be sexual, the partner's neediness, or an awareness of one or more potential benefits or rewards that are very important to them, but not necessarily sexual, women move from a sexual neutrality to seeking stimuli necessary to ignite sexual desire. This model, along with the incentive motivation model, which emerged in the Dutch context around the same time, was instrumental in shaping the new DSM-5 low desire diagnosis for women. And I'm going to get to that in just one moment. and this model and the Dutch model are always discussed in the popular articles, like the ones that I've mentioned by Daniel Bergner. This specific model, this circular sexual response cycle, you can see if you look at it, it shows that women often have this experience of sexual neutrality, but then they seek and or are receptive to stimuli. And then the idea is that, like, if they get enough rewards, if they are motivated enough, then they will kind of go back for sex again. You know, if they're getting what they need, whether it's kind of cuddling at the end, you know, whatever it is. So as you can see, I obviously have questions about this model. I think that it's very obviously heteronormative, and you know, again, it's all kind of under the guise of being female friendly. It's meant to be an alternative to the linear male-oriented 4-stage human sexual response cycle model originally put forward by Masters and Johnson. You know, which has been criticized as being not adequate to explain women's desire. But my concern is that this model just kind of reinstitutes a different framework and just says, well, women are like this, you know, so it just becomes kind of another categorized way of thinking, you know, that is just another model. But importantly, this is all done under the guise of feminism. So basically, all of this leads us to the new DSM. And some of you here might be familiar with the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition of which came out in the year 2013. And that's also the year, I believe, that the genitopelvic pain penetration disorder was also incorporated into the DSM. So we see some new diagnoses this year. Things are getting kind of interesting. And one of the new diagnoses is a female-specific low desire disorder diagnosis. And so I'm going to show you really quickly. Actually, I'm not going to show you that diagnosis, but I will. I'll just put up a picture of the DSM here so you can see this is the DSM-5. So through the new DSM-5 diagnosis, and in this, for the first time, there's this female-specific diagnosis for low desire. It's the first time that the diagnoses are split along gendered lines. So men retain the kind of the old diagnosis, and women get this new diagnosis. And there's this idea that, again, there's receptivities incorporated. These things, all the things that I've been describing are incorporated into this new diagnosis. So this is kind of the culminating moment. So in this new diagnosis, lack of receptivity is instituted as a core component of sexual dysfunction in women. As a corollary, sexual responsiveness is brought forward as a metric for healthy female sexuality. I think it's really important to consider how this alternative feminine framing of sexual health and pathology constitutes women's desire as distinctly different from men's desire, and contends that women are less driven than men are by spontaneous or internal sexual needs, more likely to engage in cost-benefit analyses of sex, as they consider possible non-sexual rewards or incentives to be gained from a given act, and more likely to feel desire only or primarily when triggered by an initiating and tacitly male partner. So all of these notions, again, which are grounded in clinical and experimental research beginning in the 1990s, help explain the shift away from the term desire as it appears in the HSDD diagnosis, which is still used for men. And that's the hypoactive sexual desire disorder diagnosis. So there's this shift, you know, from desire to interest and arousal in the new female-specific diagnosis. And so, you know, I think kind of like embedded in this is this idea that you shouldn't be diagnosed with low desire just because you don't spontaneously want sex if you're a woman. Because of course you don't, you're a woman. Why would you want that? So the idea is that it's actually supposed to be, again, more female friendly, because it's this idea that that women are responsive and receptive. And so what's really the marker of a disorder then would be the woman who's not receptive and responsive. So again, it's meant to not pathologize women. It's actually meant to say, it's okay for you to not be spontaneously in having desire. But again, it just continues this dividing along the lines of gender. So the FSIA diagnosis suggests that because women are known to be less sexual than men, a lack of spontaneous desire on its own should not lead to a low desire diagnosis for them. Instead, it is only women who are unable to motivate a rational incentive-based interest in sex who should receive the diagnosis of FSIAD. So then, and then unlike the unresponsive woman, a healthy sexually functional woman in this paradigm will be rationally receptive and responsive to her partner's overtures, eventually priming herself to engage in sex with him, to bring her low desiring mind into line with her lubricated and vasocongested body. But I think this leaves us with the question of, well, what of the so-called disordered women who are unable to respond? And so part of what I do in the book, and I won't go through all of this, but part of what I do in the book is actually talk about the different techniques that are used currently to target women who have low desire and to try to enhance their desire. And again, a lot of the feminist anti-medicalization activism, a lot of this work has really focused on the pharmaceutical industry and has said, well, big pharma is terrible and it's so focused on, it just wants to make money and so-called disease mongering. And I think in that kind of investment in critiquing the pharmaceutical industry, there's been a lot of other techniques that are just kind of framed as female friendly and safe and kind of harmless, but that actually could potentially have harmful consequences. And so mindfulness and meditation, I think, are in that camp. And I think that this is really interesting to talk about with folks with pain, because lots of people, right, we're expected to use mindfulness and meditation to deal with chronic pain. And often that can be really helpful. I think that can be a helpful thing. But I think that what concerns me is when something like mindfulness is paired up with these really explicit kind of gendered ideas about women who are disordered, women who are discordant, women who need to work on themselves to enhance their sexuality, to optimize their desire, to bring their bodies and minds into line. Because it becomes this project where you're expected to not only be perhaps servicing a partner, right, by kind of working on yourself to alleviate pain, to enhance your desire, but also to supposedly for yourself, right? And I think in our neoliberal framework, there's this idea that we should want sex, we should have sex. It's not only good for our partners and our relationships and kind of like the world, it's good for us, right? It's good to want sex. It's healthy to want sex. It's healthy to want maybe even penetrative sex. And so I think that's the connection. That's the really big, important connection here between all of these discourses in what I call the feminized responsive desire framework and pain, experience of pain, and often what's called sexual pain or sexual dysfunction. So I'm going to go to the Q&A in a moment, but I'm just going to leave you all with one quote. So I do have one quote from, I only had a couple of participants in my study, again, who had gone directly through treatment programs designed for women with what's now called GPPPD, genitopelvic pain penetration disorder. But a lot of those individuals also did have concomitant low desire, I think kind of unsurprisingly. And that's why I was talking to them. And one of my participants at the time, the pseudonym that this person gave themselves was Astrid, and this person was going by she, her pronouns at the time, told me a little bit about this experience of going through a treatment to help her deal with pain, but then also learning about this the circular sexual response cycle model and this idea, all of these ideas, these normative ideas that I'm describing about women's desire that got kind of imported into the treatment program. And so Astrid says they explained that like in the course of a normal relationship, a heterosexual relationship just understood, that perhaps when you first start out, that both the man and the woman might experience this so-called spontaneous desire for sex with each other. But as time would go on, the man might still experience that, but the woman would no longer experience it. But what she would experience instead would be sort of a willingness to engage in sex. So she's, I guess, like more willing to be seduced. And then later in the program, the men, and here Astrid is referring to the patient's male partners who were then brought into the treatment space, were given a chance to talk about how frustrated they were. And then they were educated in this response cycle thing that we had also been taught about. Like, well, you might feel spontaneous desire for her, but she may need to be coaxed into it, kind of thing. So I think that that's a really good example of the ways that this kind of framework can go awry. And this was also a treatment program where, not only were these individuals, using dilators, different things, I think kind of with the primary goal of priming their body for penetrative sex, but often using mindfulness as well. So, and this is someone I interviewed who went through the program over 10 years ago. So I would hope that things have maybe changed in these programs. But at the time, they certainly said that that was still the case, and that there was this kind of weirdly coercive, normative, kind of cis hetero patriarchal normative nature. So I'll end with just a couple of questions that got raised for me, and then we can go to Q&A. I'll just, by saying in a neoliberal technomedical context in which optimal sexuality is figured as part of the good life, and in which men and women are posited as inherently different kinds of sexual beings, the use of mindfulness, what's called mindfulness-based sex therapy techniques, other kind of alternative techniques, to alter sexual experiences becomes worrisome. And it's in assessing these technologies and their use in the current moment that I argue that we must responsibly inquire, what are the goals of these techniques? What is the underlying theoretical framework regarding masculine versus feminine sexuality that's being espoused? What forms of desire are encouraged and which escape, or which are produced but go unaccounted for or are neglected in these interventions? And so while being in the present, mindful, attuned to one's body, overcoming discordance, all of these things may be experienced as beneficial to some women and men broadly, I am concerned not only about this mandate to what theorists have called biopolitical regimentation, a form of self-appreciation or kind of self-valorization, optimization under the conditions of neoliberalism, but also about the pairing of a technique such as this with discourses of specifically feminine receptivity. How is this technique evidence of a type of training of desire, and what are women being trained and training themselves to experience or to engage in, to enjoy, to ignore, and to what end? So I will leave it there, and I will re-invite Hannah to come back here now. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Hi, everybody. I'm back. Hannah with Tight Lipped. Thanks so much for that illuminating talk. So right now I'm opening it up. We're opening it up to everybody who's watching. If you all have questions about the talk, Allison's research, the concept of the female low desire disorder, and even if you want to share some of your own experiences encountering the medical profession when you go with questions around pain with sex and low desire. Just gonna open it up for a second. And if not, I have my own questions.
Thank you so much, Hannah, also, and thank you for folks for being here. It was kind of a lot to throw at you. I tried to go through the main kind of key points, but there's a lot. It's like a whole book. So if anybody has questions, really happy to answer anything.
I can start with a question and then maybe we'll get some. My question is, how do you think this framework that relies on the fact that men have different sexual response cycles than women influences how doctors might think about like vaginal pain or pain connected to women's sexual response?
Well, I think that, I mean, as the participants that I spoke with, I think kind of also attest to is that there's a way that like going to a doctor with pain, um, it becomes read as sexual pain, even though not everyone might understand that completely like that. You know, it might be, well, we could just do something different and still have sex, or maybe that's not the primary concern. But I think it gets read as sexual pain and sexual dysfunction. Um, and I think that that then what has been called the coital imperative by people like Nicola Gavey, you know, lots of theorists have written about this idea of kind of like the heterosexual coital imperative, meaning the idea that we're supposed to have penile vaginal intercourse. That I think that then tends to like lead treatment in ways that is again isn't always like the main reason that people are at the doctor. Um, yeah, and I just think it's kind of a disservice to, I mean, to everyone, because then it becomes, you know, people themselves who come in with vaginas that hurt understand themselves maybe as like the biggest issue is sex, and the biggest issue is like priming themselves to have intercourse. And maybe their partners start to think of it that way, you know, and there's actually like so many other ways to obviously to have sex or to relate but not have sex, you know, whole other world of different things.
Thanks. Does anyone have any questions for Allison or want to share any experiences of their own?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in people's experiences too. Again, because my study was more targeted to people with low desire than you know than specifically pain conditions. And then what I found is there's like obviously a ton of overlap between folks in those groups. I think I see. It looks like someone has a question.
Yes.
They can't talk to us, right? Like they just like type in the question, right?
Yeah, if you could type it in the chat, that would be awesome.
Yeah, people type in your stuff. I would love to hear people's thoughts and experiences.
So there's a question from Haint Poet. Is there much research on women with high desire?
I think that's a really good question. I think that there's like the terrain of sex research in just the last couple of years, I think has really started to expand more, and I think that there will be more research that starts to get directed toward that. But I think that but even that has also been pathologizing, right? Like there was also it, nymphomania has been included in various medical texts, right? And there was even in the DSM-5 there was talk of having I forget, I mean hypersexual, I think it was going to be hyperactive desire disorder, which we also know would certainly pathologize women, right? It would like that would be the way. So it's I think that's kind of the other side of this, right? If we have this idea that, well, the people we call women are more receptive and responsive sexually, then, you know, and again, that's been this way of being like, but it's okay, like women are just like that, and women, that's a fine form of desire. And it is a fine form of desire. But I also don't think it's just women who have that, right? There's all kinds of people who are responsive and receptive. But sorry, that was a little bit of a digression. But the point is that so then having like high kind of like spontaneous desire has definitely been historically, and I think today, pathologized. Like it's like looked down upon if you have that going on. I think that's especially true for women, and I think that we also know that it's highly racialized. So there's ways that we, I think in the beginning when I was talking about the ways that this discourse tends to be racialized, it's also, we have expectations that women of color will have higher desire and are more likely to, to have that experience. But then that's also pathologized. Yeah, I mean, and that's part of the kind of the nastiness of the racing of all of this, because the entire history of sex difference discourse is racialized, right? It's built upon white female receptivity. It's the idea that like as cultures evolve, like that men and women will become more and more different. I mean, that's literally like kind of paired next to eugenics discourse historically. So yeah, I think there's a lot about race here that needs to also be like really unpacked more and more.
Thanks,
Sorry, that was a kind of
Allison.
meandering answer. There's a lot.
Are there any follow-up questions to that or new questions around the creation of the category low female sexual desire, the treatments that have been used, how it's appeared in your own life, in the doctor's office?
And connections to pain. I think that's just so interesting, like to think about the fact that all of these people came to talk to me about their desire, but then also had pelvic floor conditions that were either diagnosed or undiagnosed. Sorry, maybe that took you off course.
No. I have a question in the meantime. So what would be, I guess, what way would you see? So there's a lot of ways that like gender and the medicalization of female desire ends up producing these categories of, actually, not wanting sex is both natural to being a woman, but also then a problem that's inherent with women. But also then if you really don't want sex, then you're an extra problem. Is there, it would, sorry, I'm kind of flipping in and out, but what sort of work do you think would be helpful in breaking down the sort of gendered separation? Would it be more sort of research about the similarities of the sexual response cycle? Would it be throwing out the sexual response cycle?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I talked with a student the other day who wants to be a sex therapist. And she was like, is there any way to do this without kind of like playing into these tropes? Or is just like sex therapy just like kind of this endeavor that's like going to just always be fraught in this way? And I mean, I don't think I do have concerns about the history, of this and its connections to things like conversion therapy, just all the ways that it's been really misused. And that sexology has produced these categories over and over again. I don't think that sex therapy has to be, I think there's sex therapists who do good work. I mean, if people want to have sex and like figure out how to do that in a way that works better for them and they want to go to a therapist, then that's awesome and they should totally do that. But yeah, I think that I don't think that like sex therapy or sex research like holds the key necessarily. And I have actually, my next project, I'll be hopefully writing more on this, but I think that what we've seen in the last couple of years, just the last like 5 years or so, like, because a lot of the research that I talk about in my book is primarily like up until 2010, 12, 13, 15, but then things have started to shift. And I think that what we see now more is psychologists and sexologists doing research on, what's the experience of non-binary people? What's the experience of, of like do trans women have low desire? Like, what's their experience? that research kind of worries me too. I think that I don't think it's terrible. I think it's like great, fine, you can do that, but I don't know that that's going to be the kind of the way out. It's just to create more categories of study. So I don't know. I think that in my conclusion to my book, I make a call for what I call fracturing and falling apart as kind of an antidote to this mentality of keeping it together. And I argue that ultimately a lot of these, like whether it's the medication or mindfulness, you're supposed to keep it together, right? You're supposed to write for capitalism, like for your partner, for your family, and I think that, so to me it sounds like what would be potentially more liberating is to kind of just like fall apart a little bit, but in community, like with other people. And I don't know exactly what that means, and I'm looking for more kind of ethnographic examples of where we see that. So if anybody has any ideas, I would love to hear that too. Like places where people who, I mean, I think that Tight-Lipped is a good example of a community, of a place where people are coming together around sharing similar experiences and kind of speaking back to the discourses. So yeah, more stuff like that.
Thanks. I think we have the one question we have is, how much sexual research are we getting without involving men?
Does that if I could ask for a clarification, I guess, on that. Does that mean that involves men, or Hannah, how do you interpret that?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I interpret it as research by doctors and scientists who aren't men, but also thinking about sexual response cycles that aren't tied to the sort of heterosexual relationship. Yeah, it centers women's pleasure. That's not like, again, like what we were saying, that so much of this research, the desired goal, and for people with vaginal pain, the desired goal is to be able to have a penis inserted into you. And that is very much not often the goal. Sometimes it is, of people who have vaginas. So yeah, that centers like women's pleasure, and not like the heterosexual sort of penis and vagina sex.
Yeah, I mean, that's hard because I feel like I'm not sure how much of the research is, like how much any of the research is focused on pleasure. I actually think that the research is just kind of meant to I think it's meant to understand things more, right? Like that's like kind of the idea. But in a traditional kind of Foucauldian fashion, I think that it also ends up creating the very categories that we then end up living by, which is my argument. So I don't know that any research centers women's pleasure. I think that there's some research that is more concerned with thinking through, well, yeah, which I guess does start to try to think through like what gives women pleasure. And yeah, I mean, I think some of it's successful at like thinking through, there's been some research on like the orgasm gap, in a lot of like straight culture, wherein I just saw a quote today from, just on like one of those meme things on Instagram, of a quote, I think by Laurie Mintz, who's a doctor, I think a sex researcher who's kind of in this world, who talked about how, now I can't remember the numbers, but it's something like, in encounters where women have sex with women, like hookups, they orgasm like some close to like 70% of the time, and with men it's like 7% of the time. And then I think there was a number for masturbation also put in there, which was also really high. So I think even just like having more doctors and clinicians coming out and saying things like that is good. But I think it's a fine line. I think I don't know. I don't want to I think it is good, but I also, I think that it also becomes part of the backdrop in which people expect those things to be the case, right? Like those kinds of relations to be how things are. So exposing it is good, but then I don't know what we do about it. You know, I mean, we obviously need like better sex ed education and a more ethical, pleasurable society that takes all kinds of pleasure seriously. Um, so yeah, that's not a very good answer. I think there's definitely some like there's like more research about like the clitoris and like people with these body parts like and how to give them pleasure. But I don't know that like even improving technique is also the answer. And I don't know that I don't think there's very often a divorcing of talking about people with those body parts from thinking about a straight cultural backdrop, if that makes sense. Does that make some sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's a good note to end on, that we need to find a society that actually allows for the conditions of pleasure, instead of focusing so much on lack. Are there any other questions, comments, thoughts before we wrap up the live?
Amanda said, yes, it does. Does that mean it made sense? I know, Amanda. Yeah, I mean, I guess like I could also just kind of gesture toward work where I think people are doing good stuff. I think that like, I mean, the person that comes to mind a lot is Sophie Lewis, who's getting a lot of kind of press right now for her erotophobia octopus piece. Um, but I think her book Full Surrogacy Now really thinks about like in a more communal way, like what it would be like to kind of to support people's bodies and their functions outside of gender norms. Like, what if we just took care of people who gestated, you know, without forcing a gender narrative onto that? And I think a similar thing is kind of what I'm calling for is like, what if we tried to think about pleasure through the lenses of asexuality, of not only queerness but asexuality or demisexuality or disability, you know, as a way to kind of to recapture, or I don't know, kind of just like rethink sex and pleasure, and feeling good. And in the process, we could also kind of like shift away from such an emphasis on certain body parts that we know doesn't work, that doesn't work for a lot of people. Yeah. And to Haint Poet's last point there, then also just like, and I think that would be good for women and those who identify as women and also just everyone.
Thank you so much, Allison. This was very illuminating, and I'm really excited about your research. And obviously, you know, at Tight Lipped, we are all about breaking down what society expects of us when it comes to sex, when it comes to our bodies, when it comes to our vulvas, our vaginas, and our partners' body parts. So this is really great. And we need more people who are thinking critically about how to change the conversation around, you know, what is good sex? What is sex? How should we be having sex? That actually centers, you know, what people want and need, and not all the things we've been told we want and need. Great.
I would agree.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who joined. We'll be posting the full version with captions.
Oh God. I did not mean to do that. Okay. I thought there were gonna just be some like trickly stars.
Trickly stars. Now it was very much you. You're a star.
Sorry, what were you saying?
Just saying that the full thing will be posted with captions if you're interested, or you want to, you know, send it to somebody who you think would be interested in this topic. And if you want to learn more about Tight Lipped, you can follow us. We have a newsletter, and you know, we are joined in the project of decentering. Penetrative sex is the goal, and centering what our bodies want and need. So Thanks so much. Any last words from you, Allison, before we leave?
Just thanks to you. Thanks to everybody at Tight Lipped. Yeah, I think you all are doing awesome work. I hope everybody supports Tight Lipped. You already do, a lot of people. So yeah, follow Tight Lipped, listen to the podcast. The zine is awesome. And then you can also follow me on Instagram, which is where Hannah is speaking to you from, is my account. Yeah, and I would love to answer any questions that people have via email or Instagram message. My account is public, so hit me up.
Great.
Okay. And so do I just end this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Good seeing you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.